Jealousy brings suffering. The Bodhisatta was formerly a well-known teacher in the entire country. Long before this, a wealthy landowner in a village provided support for a good monk. The landowner once invited an arahant to remain at the neighborhood monastery so they could continue their conversation after the arahant's arrival, since he was so moved by his manner and his teachings. The local monk planned to prevent this from happening because he was afraid that his patron would start helping the arahant instead of himself. The local monk was scheduled to accompany the arahant to the landowner's house the following morning, but he instead went alone after ringing the gong with the back of his fingernail so the arahant wouldn't hear it. He explained to his sponsor that the arahant had disregarded his wake-up call and that the meal provided the previous day was not fancy enough for him to want to return. Instead, the landowner asked the village monk to bring him a bowl of good food, thinking that the arahant must have been tired from his journey. The monk did not deliver the food because he was still behaving out of jealousy. He was immediately overcome with regret, became unwell, and passed away shortly after. The monk was born 500 times as an ogre who was never satisfied. 500 more times as an always ravenous dog. Finally 500 times as a starved child named Mittavindaka in a family of beggars after spending hundreds of thousands of years in hell. His mother and father, who had been suffering from constant hunger since the boy was born, were aware that Mittavindaka had cursed them and exiled them from their village. Mittavindaka, who was now homeless, roamed aimlessly and arrived in the city where the Bodhisatta was giving lessons. He was accepted as a charity scholar at the school run by the Bodhisatta, but he frequently got into arguments with other pupils and showed disdain for the Bodhisatta. Not long after, Mittavindaka fled to a far-off village and found employment as a laborer. After having 2 children with a lowly wife, he was finally employed by the locals to instruct them in the correct faith. The village, however, endured hardship. The monarch chastised it 7 times, it was destroyed by fire 7 times, and its water source ran dry 7 times. The people beat Mittavindaka and drove him away when they understood that all of this bad luck started after he moved. Mittavindaka found his family devoured by demons in a spooky woodland where he ended up. He resumed his travels and discovered employment on a ship. The wind ceased on his 7th day at sea, and the ship became immobile. When Mittavindaka won the coin toss to determine who had cursed them, he was placed on a bamboo raft after winning 7 times in a row. The moment he was overboard, the boat started to sail once more. He spent 7 joyous days with them until they had to go for a week of penance. Mittavindaka's raft drifted to an island where 4 goddesses lived in a crystal palace, notably Vimanapadas, deities whose glorious existence are frequently disrupted by hellish tortures. He subsequently came across 16 of these goddesses in a jewel palace, 8 more in a silver palace, and eventually 32 in a gold palace. He always departed when the goddesses did. Then Mittavindaka arrived at an ogre city. One of them moved around appearing to be a goat. Mittavindaka grabbed the goat by its leg with the intention of eating it. Not realizing her actual appearance, the ogre threw him across the sea in a fit of rage, and he came to rest in the dry mud around the city of the Bodhisatta. Mittavindaka reasoned that if one of the king's goats could toss him all the way here, surely another goat could throw him back to one of the islands. The king's goats were grazing in the moat. He grabbed the goat by the leg, and when it started to bleat loudly, the goatherders who were hiding nearby to catch thieves raced out and grabbed him. After beating Mittavindaka, they began to carry him to the king. The Bodhisatta noticed his old pupil in bonds as he was leaving the city to take a bath. The Bodhisatta requested permission to take Mittavindaka as a slave after the goatherders gave an explanation of their reasons for seizing him. They concurred. What had Mittavindaka been doing all these years? The Bodhisatta inquired. The Bodhisatta heard the tale and advised Mittavindaka that all that suffering could have been prevented if he had been less resistant and accepted his assistance at the time. In the Buddha's lifetime, Losaka, an older disciple of the Buddha, was perpetually unlucky and never had enough to eat. All of his hamlet's fishermen were unable to catch even one fish on the day of his conception, and the community was repeatedly burned down by fire and pillaged by the monarch while he was still in the womb. The village's bad luck persisted until people identified the offending family by splitting into 2 bands and observing which group was plagued by ruin, then dividing that group, and so forth, and drove them away. After Losaka was born, his mother reared him for a little period of time, enough for him to be put out into the world as a beggar, and then she fled. One of the Buddha's most important followers, Sariputta, observed the filthy youngster, Losaka, age 7, picking up rice grains thrown in the street after the pots had been cleaned. Sariputta invited Losaka to become a novice after hearing his tale. He nodded in agreement and later accepted full discipleship, but his misfortune persisted even after he attained the rank of arahant, and he rarely received enough food during his alms rounds to provide for his basic needs. However, a magic force caused a single ladle of rice to emerge and fill his alms bowl to the full. Upon seeing this, no one else offered him more. people weren't being rude to him on purpose. Sariputta sensed that it was Losaka's last day on earth and determined that it was time for him to receive a full dinner. Losaka accompanied Sariputta on the morning alms tour, but they both received nothing due to Losaka's misfortune. As a result, he sent Losaka back to the monastery and went food shopping alone. When Sariputta got back, he sent some food to Losaka, but the guy in charge of delivering it forgot and ate it himself. When Sariputta inquired about Losaka's enjoyment of his lunch that afternoon, Losaka replied that no food had been delivered. It was almost afternoon and too late for the disciples to enjoy a supper at this point. Sariputta went to the palace and requested that the king fill his bowl with honey, ghee, butter, and sugar so that the disciples could consume them whenever they pleased. In order to prevent any accidents, he brought the food back and held Losaka's bowl while he ate. After that, Losaka continued to eat until he was full. Shortly after that, he entered nirvana. Losaka Aesop was born previously as Mitavindaka. The purpose of the parable was for the Buddha to explain to the other disciples how Losaka, after experiencing such terrible hardship in his life, was nevertheless able to become an arahant.